Hey guys, and welcome back to the channel. If you're new or part of the large percentage of people who are still not subscribed to this YouTube channel, make sure that you do that so that these videos will show right up in your feed. Also make sure to like the video if you're enjoying all the content. Now, the Steel Champion is a build that I made a really long time ago. This was right around when the Steel skills got their first rework. Back then, it was capable of doing pretty much all content in the game with just like a Terminus S and some basic gear. However, times have changed, and I do want to give a quick shout out to Don the Crown for keeping this build warm in the meantime, but with the new changes to the passive tree, as well as some pretty substantial buffs to this build, I felt that it was time for it to get a new coat of paint. So this is one of those builds where the more that you invest into it, the more that the character rewards you. Each piece of gear, each jewel, each gem that you upgrade, each passive skill optimization that you make, all just results in a ridiculous amount of strength in this character. It is an absolutely excellent farming character that can turn into an endgame bosser with a simple 1 gem swap. We use Splitting Steel in the endgame for clear, as well as Lancing Steel for single target. Early on, you'll be using Shattering Steel just because that ability is very strong, but the absolutely ridiculous clear and life gain and leech and everything that you can get later on once you have the Savior as well as Paradoxica is just too powerful to give up. Now, while theoretically, as far as I can tell, this build has been massively buffed and I have done my best to make the path of building as accurate as I can, there probably will be changes needing to be made over the course of the beginning of the league. So these path of buildings for my build guides are going to be living guides. They're going to change as we figure things out, as we go through the league. I'll make upgrades to them as we get more information. And do keep in mind that not all of the mechanics are actually in path of building yet. As of the time of this recording, I'm pretty sure Fortify scaling is not working properly, so make sure to check back in this video occasionally to get the most updated POB. It's going to be down in the description. Also down in the description is a link to my Discord. There is going to be a channel sometime around the beginning of the league that has all of the information for this build within it. If you can't use path of building because you're on console, or for some reason path of building doesn't work for you, make sure to join my Discord. That channel should be available around the time that league is starting. Now, I do want to give a couple disclaimers. I would say that this build is not really suited for a new player to push into the very deep endgame. This build will take some know-how of the game to be able to get really to the very peak of content. If you are a new player, you should be able to manage low-tier red maps, even some high-tier red maps, but when you're making that jump into the very endgame, this may not be the build for you. However, if you are comfortable with like gear transitions as well as like skill tree transitions, knowing how to balance auras and life percentages and such, this build is absolutely ridiculously rewarding. I just wanted to get that disclaimer out there. Also about this path of building, there is a lot going on in this particular path of building, and the damage that you actually do is very hard to be accurate within path of building. As you can see, we have reflections from the Savior Sword in our full DPS. This is without any of the Flasks on. It's with very minimal like configuration settings here. This is with 2020 skill gems as well as some alt quality stuff. You can disable any of those that you like if you don't want the, say, extra quality on all of your gems. Just turn those off to see a more accurate amount of damage. I simply put these in here because these are what you should be going towards. If I had to make like multiple different sets with different qualities and all that kind of stuff, this entire skill section would be like quadruple in size, and it's already pretty large. I want to try to keep it, you know, as compact as I can. So make sure that you change those for your personal character, or if you're wanting to see like more realistic DPS, I guess, you can also enable Flasks. I just want to kind of show you the moment that I enable these two Flasks, the DPS goes up by like double. So just keep in mind, this is as little POB warrior as I can get. Early on, we are going to be using just whatever two-hand we can get a hold of that is able to be used with steel skills. That means axes and swords. We don't get any specific axe or sword nodes very early on, so you are free to simply do whichever one ends up best early on. Sometimes if you need accuracy, swords tend to be better, but axes tend to be more damage very early on. These early trees are just meant to get you a ton of resistances, life, some generic damage, and we also will be able to have maximum impale very early with this wheel here, Dread Banner, Shattering Steel, as well as our Ascendancy. Also do keep in mind that as you go through the levels, it will tell you which Ascendancy points to take in order, and then on top of that, once you do get all the way up here to the higher levels, you'll see at 87 there is a respec to dual wielding. The idea is that for the most part, a Terminus S can carry you through the vast majority of the game. As soon as you start hitting like tier 12, 13, maybe 14 maps, you'll start to notice a bit of a slowdown. This is the point where you should be trying to transition into dual wielding. We are personally going to be using Ichimonjis in the dual wield transition version here. This is going to provide us a decent amount of damage, but it also means our buffs are more effective on us, think like fortify and things like that, as well as giving us some reduced reservation of skills. This will get us towards this dual wield transition tree that you can see here. The benefit of having this dual wield transition tree is that we are going to be able to scale dual wield block. Dual block is very powerful, and with a roomies that you can get a little bit later on, you are able to get 50-50 block and spell block. Now, also do keep in mind that if you want a little bit more block chance, you can use Skeva in your offhand, but you'll have to adjust your auras and such. Skeva will give you additional block chance in the offhand, as well as just some global attack speed, which is pretty nice. So you can use this early on for a little bit more defensives. As you can see here, if we change over to the Skeva, we'll be at 50-20, and then you will be able to, if you wanted to, you could swap out your Granite Flask for the roomies, activate the roomies, and you're at 50-45 block. It's going to be pretty powerful for very early on in the game if you're able to get a hold of those items. Now, when we move into the end game dual wield tree, the main thing here is going to be getting our weapons. As we move into the mid-tier gear, this is around the time that you're going to want to make a transition into the low-life version of the build. There are notes about when and how you should do this in the actual note section. You can go into here, scroll down, and there's a bunch of information there. Your first goal should be getting this Savior Sword. This in your offhand is essentially doubling of your damage. If you look here, you'll notice that the reflections have been turned off, and you see 4.4 million damage, right? 4.4 million total damage. When we swap around gear sets, unfortunately, the reflections get turned off. So if you take these reflections, we have 2 of them because there are 2 reflections from the Savior, include them in full DPS, our DPS jumps up to 12.6 million. Now, whether or not this is 100% accurate DPS, it really depends on a lot of things. As I said, it's very hard to get accurate DPS and POB for this ability, but do keep in mind, this is without Flasks, this is without any of the extra things, so the DPS should be relatively close, even accounting for player ability and uptime and things like that. So the Savior is a very, very powerful sword. Paradoxica, you can get any version that you like. It is simply the percentage fizz damage and the unique modifier that says attacks with this weapon deal double damage that are important. Typically, like a crit blind version is a little bit cheaper. Just make sure that you try to get crit, you try to get physical attack damage, and then anything else is just whatever you can get a hold of. Another note about Lionized Vision is that early on you can get a 5-link Lionized Vision for clearing. This will allow you to have a pseudo 6-link with the Pierce from here. This is a pretty good chess piece. If you can get a 6-link, of course it's going to be better as well. Rislatha should be relatively cheap again this league, because last league in Expedition it was cheap because of Gwen gambling. Gwen is back. I don't know what the numbers and such are going to be, but that is assuming this. The rest of the gear is simply just going to be just some life resistances. This helmet has increased fizz damage of nearby enemies. It's relatively easy to craft this. We've also got Impale Chance on our gloves. You're going to need Impale Chance on your gloves when you do swap over into Lancing Steel. But besides that, there's not really much else to go through here. The expensive gear is much different. There's a lot of information to go over here, but that's not going to be covered in this League Start Guide. Now, as said previously, it has all of the leveling abilities that you should use, as well as the endgame skills. Now, you might notice that there's a lot of different auras that are available here. Early on, you're going to want to be using these auras, Dread Banner, Herald of Purity, Precision, and Vitality. These will be the ones that you use pre-Ichimonji. After you've moved over to Ichimonji, you probably can swap into Pride after you're swapped into dual wielding. If you're using only one Ichimonji, you might need to lower the level of the precision a little bit, but it should still be viable. After you have made the low life transition into Petrified Blood, you will be using some auras on your life as well as some auras on your mana. Keep in mind, Herald of Purity and Enlighten here are only enabled for the very expensive version of this build. And then last but not least, the notes are pretty extensive. There's a lot of information in here for you to go through, as well as some crafting information or how to obtain certain pieces of gear. If you have questions, make sure that you look at the notes. If not, you can always join my Discord, bunch of helpful people in there. But remember, it's not their job to help you, they're just happy to sometimes. Now, that was a lot more information in this path of building section simply because there was many things to go over, but let's go ahead and talk about some damage. So when it comes to scaling damage on this build, we are an Impale based build. Essentially, if you would like to know how Impale works without getting too complicated into it, each Impale stack that you have on the enemy causes you to do 10% more damage, and then that is increased by by the effectiveness of your Impale. That is not actually how it works, but the actual explanation for Impale is very confusing, very in-depth. It's a rule of thumb that kind of works for the most part. Don't worry too much about it. More Impale stacks equals more damage. We also do scale crit, and added physical damage to our attacks gives us a substantial boost because of Paradoxica later on in the game. Paradoxica doubles the amount of damage that you do with the weapon, so any added physical damage to weapons essentially is getting doubled. That's why things like steel rings are very good. The champion ascendancy is very, very powerful because it does have the stacking of physical damage that you get per stack of Impale. And then through all of our auras and through all of our buffs and through the use of these Impale stacks and consistent use of Call of Steel versus our main attack, we are able to do ridiculous amounts of damage. Now, talking about defensives, this build has been pretty massively updated in the defensive department. We're no longer stacking dodge because dodge isn't really realistic for this build anymore. We are now going to be stacking dual wield block. There is a lot of support on the tree for dual wield block. We're able to get 50-50 with a flask up, meaning the Rumi's flask, as well as just all of the block nodes taken on the tree. That's why we like stretch all the way around the tree, as you can see in the path of building. On top of that, we do have fortify scaling. Keep in mind now that fortitude has 20 stacks given by the actual champion. We cannot scale the effectiveness anymore of this as a champion because typically the way that they scale effectiveness now is with additional fortitude stacks. We cannot get those because we are not technically a melee build. Beyond that, this build does get access to elusive due to a dual wield mastery that's towards the bottom of the tree that's going to give us some avoidance. We have a decent amount of armor. It is not a huge amount. I'm going to see potentially if we can scale this armor a little bit further once we get a little bit into the league and I see how things end up. And then we do have a small amount of blind and evasion. Now, that is most to do with the actual damage prevention. What this build excels at is recovery. We are Petrified Blood low life, which means that we are going to have only 50% of our health bar. There is an explanation for Petrified Blood in the path of building, but essentially what it does is it means that it takes half of the damage that you would take and deals it to you over time. This has a few benefits, such as we are able to proc adrenaline from our ascendancy constantly, as well as being essentially overleeching at all times, similar to what the Slayer has. And due to our massive amount of recovery, we can simply recover all of that damage that we would be taking from Petrified Blood. Also, with the addition of masteries and Lead Shade, we will be taking significantly less damage over time, which was the main thing that kind of, killed this build sometimes, because Petrified Blood doesn't work very well with damage over time taken. We get 10% from the Fortify Mastery, as well as 50% less damage taken from damage over time if you started taking damage over time in the last second. Should smooth things out quite a bit. As for how we actually get that recovery, we have a ton of leech, as well as life gained on hit. Especially when we're using Lancing Steel on bosses, we're hitting 20, 30, 40 times per second, if not more than that. And this allows us to scale any life gain on hit into the sky. So excellent defensive layers, excellent recovery layers. Petrified Blood is a little bit confusing, but there's more information about that in the path of building. Now, why should you choose this build? If you are the kind of player who wants to play one build this league, you want to be able to scale all the way from the beginning, all the way to the end of the game, you enjoy improving your character, making those little incremental upgrades, and you're not afraid of having a slightly more difficult character to gear, this build is absolutely ridiculously rewarding. All of that said, if this build does still look appealing to you and you are a relatively new player, just understand that you will be able to make it to like high tier yellows, early tier reds relatively comfortably, but you are going to hit a wall most likely that you will need to start learning a little bit more about the build. The build is very powerful, but I do want to give you the disclaimer that it is not 100% new player friendly. And that is going to be it. I am pretty excited about the future of this build, the new dual wield block tech and potentially some armor scaling and things like that. We'll see how it ends up, and as I said, I will do updates to the path of building as well as the Discord channels as we get time. So make sure to check back here every once in a while to get those kinds of updates. Also, I forgot to say this on the last video, but I will be live on Twitch for the actual release, and we will be hanging out doing all kinds of cool stuff towards the beginning of the league, so make sure to follow me on Twitch at twitch.tv/bigducks. And remember, if you're enjoying the content, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the YouTube channel for more content similar to this, and stay safe out there in raid class. And I'll see you guys in the next video.